Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you so much for joining us on Hub Dialogues.
Absolute pleasure to join you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm flattered you're interested.
Very interested. I want to start off with Canada. We're at a somewhat strange moment here in this country, where Canadians are not just concerned about the future of the country, but also fearful in some ways as it relates to Donald Trump's threats around tariffs, his talk of us being the America's 51st state. And in times of existential crisis, you obviously look towards your allies. You look towards people, in some cases, countries that Canada has shed blood for. In this case, being Mother England. And a lot of Canadians have felt that your government and Prime Minister have been quite silent. When they look across the ocean, when they listen for calls of help, they're not hearing much in return. Can you tell me why Canadians shouldn't feel abandoned by Britain right now?
Well, I'm very sorry if that's the case, because Canada is a closer ally of the United Kingdom than the United States is. That you are a true friend and have been throughout your history, really. Two of my children were home from school on Monday, and I thought I would do a bit of home teaching. And I taught them about 1759 and General Wolfe, and why Canada and the United Kingdom share a king, and why we are such important and close allies. I think this is fundamental to my nation and to yours in our history and our connection. I think the king has been magnificent. He has shown important support, quite rightly, for one of the countries of which he is king. And these have been symbolic presentations and an audience given to your new Prime Minister, Mark Carney. I don't understand why Keir Starmer has been so quiet on this. That, of course, we want to get on with the United States, but Canada is a much closer friend than the United States to us. We have a much greater shared history. And indeed, Canada began, really, because people didn't want to be part of the United States. We think all the people who leave the United States, or what became the United States in 1776, to become Canadians, they left because they didn't like the republicanism of the United States. And I think we should be clear to Donald Trump that if he wants Canada to be the 51st state, well, he'd find that he had a king over the United States and he was a prime minister rather than the president. And actually, if Canadians had been voting last November, Donald Trump might not have won. So you should always be careful about what you ask for.
Jacob, to you, are we a more impressive democratic project than the United States below us?
Oh, of course you are. You've got the Westminster system, which I think works very well. You've got a very sophisticated federal system, which has managed to keep Quebec part of Canada in spite of considerable difficulties. I'm very fortunate. I used to manage money for one or two Canadian provinces, so I've had a very happy relationship with the provinces of Canada over my professional career.
You mentioned His Majesty. He is your king. He is our king. You mentioned some of the symbolic gestures he's made, whether it be he planted a maple tree at Buckingham Palace a few days ago. He sat in a Canadian chair at the Commonwealth Service. He wore a red tie at some point. He wore Canadian medals at another point. What's your message to Canadians, though, who see that as sort of, a coded breadcrumb trail of gestures when they're looking for full-throated support from the monarch of their country to defend them right now?
Well, the king acts on the advice of his prime minister, but that can be his Canadian prime minister as well as his British prime minister. So he should receive advice from your new prime minister. I would strongly encourage the king to open the Canadian Parliament after your elections. I think that would be a much more tangible sign of the support from your king. He is your king as much as he's my king.
You mentioned our new prime minister. Mark Carney was sworn in a few days ago. When this episode comes out, we'll be in the midst of an election. At that point, he'll be Liberal leader. But he's someone who has a close connection to your country. I think he spent a quarter of his life in your country, and you've had many dealings with him in the past. He was governor of the Bank of England for a number of years. What's your impression of Mr. Carney?
Well, he was absolutely terrible governor of the Bank of England. He failed on monetary policy. Part of the reason we had inflation a couple of years ago take off was because He was utterly unable to reverse quantitative easing. He kept on saying he would and then didn't. He ran a zero interest rate policy for too long. So he was hopeless on monetary policy, which was his main job. But he also was not an independent governor of the Bank of England. He was deeply political. He's much more suited to being a political candidate than an independent bank governor. He wanted to tell the United Kingdom how to run itself without going through the effort of standing for election. And that was disgraceful that he intervened in the Brexit debate in a completely partial and heavy-handed manner. He was part of Project Fear, and carried on with that against all the evidence afterwards. So I think he was bad for the Bank of England, damaged the reputation of the Bank of England, and was a failure in terms of British monetary policy. Um, I wish Canada extremely well, and it's not for me to interfere in your direct politics, but frankly, Canada's welcome to him.
You, I think, called him at one point a second-tier Canadian politician. I don't know if that was just a dig at him or us too, but was it your sense when you worked with him that he had political aspirations and that, he was a senior public servant, but that he had aspirations to have your job to be a senior politician?
Well, I mean, certainly not a jibe at Canada. Canada's a country I hold in the highest possible regard. It was, I'm afraid, a jibe at him. Um, Basically, he couldn't win against Trudeau the first time round, so he accepted the job as governor of the Bank of England. But initially, he only accepted it for a shorter term because he thought he might be able, as far as one could tell, get back into Canadian politics. So his primary interest was Canadian politics rather than being a good governor of the Bank of England. Now, I don't think being an active politician and governing the Bank of England are compatible jobs. Central bankers have independence for a very good reason, to try and take them out of politics. He decided to immerse himself in politics, and that was very damaging for the Bank of England's reputation and indeed for the UK economy.
You've also called him an enemy of Brexit, the high priest of Project Fear, a partisan. What exactly do you point to as the actions he took that you feel were political, that was him getting, meddling where he shouldn't?
Oh, well, if you take the ABR at the time, the Office of Budget Responsibility, it would make no forecasts on what would happen with Brexit because it said its job was to deal with what government policy was, not what it may become. It was completely impartial. It gave no view. The Bank of England kept on saying, that's why I said the High Priest of Project Fear, kept on giving his view of how disastrous for the British economy Brexit would be, which has all turned out to be wrong. So it was purely, he was doing the bidding of the then Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was dancing to the tune of the Remain campaign and using the Bank of England as his orchestra. And that seemed to me to be deeply improper for a supposedly politically impartial figure.
Just a little bit of role reversal here, because I want to get more of a sense of your criticism. Let's say you're the governor of the Bank of England. Cold, hard numbers, which you see as independent economic forecasts, are being put in front of you on your desk during the Brexit debate. And they show that the British economy will be worse if Brexit goes through. Your mandate is to maintain the financial stability of the country. So what was he supposed to do in that scenario when he saw those numbers and felt that they would be damaging to the country?
Exactly what he would have done if he were getting those sorts of figures in relation to a general election, which is nothing. I asked this question actually at the Treasury Select Committee and never got a satisfactory answer. That is to say, at that point, Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the opposition. If the Bank of England thought that the Labour Party's economic policy would be damaging, in an election period, it was not the job of the Bank of England to say so, because that is a matter for voters to determine. It's a matter of immediate political controversy, and that is not the job of an independent central bank. And those forecasts turned out to be wrong. So not only was he backing bad forecasts, but he was getting involved in a political way, and that was improper.
At the time, he called it the biggest domestic risk facing the UK economy. So all these years later, and I know there's just an anniversary celebrated in terms of Brexit, how do you feel Brexit has turned out? Was it everything you imagined?
Oh, I think it gets better every day. I mean, we have saved ourselves billions and billions of pounds by not being part of EU schemes. We're not part of the EU COVID scheme, which is billions of pounds of government expenditure, which we would have taken on and we'd have paid to subsidize European countries. So it's effectively overseas aid. We've saved ourselves that. We have a flourishing AI industry in the UK because we haven't adopted European regulations. This is perhaps the most important economic activity for the next century. We're way ahead of the rest of Europe because we're not in the European Union. So those are two very big benefits to start with. And then the fundamental one, that actually how you vote determines your government rather than it being overruled by a bunch of bureaucrats in Brussels. So it's been good economically and constitutionally for the United Kingdom.
Are Brits not getting this? Because I look at this YouGov poll this year saying only 11% of Britons say Brexit has been more of a success. I don't know what more of a success means, but you can tell me how you interpret that. Are they not understanding, the benefits, or are they, seeing failures?
You've got to look at opinion polls in the round. Very few people have actually changed their mind on Brexit. There are very few people who voted for Brexit who now wish that they hadn't. The opinion polls, even in the run-up to Brexit, indicated that Remain was more likely to win than leave. So opinion polls never really fully got the support that Brexit had. And I think in the period since we've left, an awful lot of other things have gone on, which have been difficult. So we had COVID, which was very difficult. We've had the war in Ukraine and the effect that had on energy prices, which has been difficult. And we've got a Labour economy, a Labour government that is not helping the economy with some of its tax policies. And so there are some things that get attributed to Brexit because we haven't had a booming economy since we left that are actually nothing to do with Brexit.
Mm. Just one more question on this whole idea of Brexit and Carney's participation with it and your dealings with him. And I did watch those proceedings. It was very interesting seeing your exchanges. You two are similar in some ways, though. You're both devout Catholics. Mr. Carney apparently attends Mass twice a week. Did you feel any sort of kinship with him, or was there just nothing there?
Well, I don't really know him personally, so I didn't know he was a Catholic. I'm delighted to hear it. But it does seem to me there's a glorious irony that Mr. Carney is your Prime Minister now, trying to stop you being ruled by the United States. And when he was the Governor of the Bank of England, he wanted the UK to be governed by Europe. It's rather marvellous reversal of tone from him, and he seems to be becoming more in favour of independent sovereign nations than he was when he was Governor of the Bank of England.
Let's look at your party, the Conservatives, and I know you're sort of licking your wounds right now and trying to figure out what your next moves are. You've picked a new leader in Kemi Badenoch. You had suffered the worst electoral defeat in your party's history, I believe. You yourself lost a seat. Much of it was at the hands of a new party called Reform UK, led by Nigel Farage. I think you said he took 4 million of the 7 million votes that you lost. They're beating you in the polls. They allegedly have more members. Why do you think they're capturing so many people on the right in your country right now? And what have you learned from that?
Well, I think if you look at where our vote went in 2024 from 2019, we lost 7 million votes. 4 million went to Reform, roughly. 2.3 million stayed at home. And 700,000 went to Labour, Lib Dems and the Greens. The reason we did so badly is we hadn't been Conservative. And even Kemi Badenoch has said this, that we talked right and acted left, is I think how she put it. And Conservative voters got very fed up with that. And Nigel Farage is talking Conservative talk. He's talking about low taxation. He's talking about dealing with the migration problem. He's talking about stopping the net zero nonsense that is making the country cold and poor. So Nigel is talking about things that will make people's standard of living better. And the Conservatives in our last administration were going along with the blob in making people's standard of living worse. And that's why he's garnered so much support. Now, I'm very glad that Kemi is now saying Conservative things. That's hugely important for the Conservatives.
I love this quote from you, that Conservatives do badly when we are, you can define this for me, middle, muddle, fiddle fuddle. What's middle, muddle, fiddle fuddle?
Wait. There's no point in being in politics just to do what the consensus would have you do. You need to do things that will make things better. And the middle muddle fiddle fuddle is just going along with what the civil service tell you to do, what the bureaucrats want, and not changing things, and hoping that that will create a consensus between left and right. The most successful prime ministers have clear ideas of what they want to do and push it through, regardless of where the consensus is.
What did you see your role in Parliament as? Were you someone whose job it was to sort of rock the boat and remind other Conservatives that they need to, hold true to their values and push every now and then? What did you see your sort of role as on that parliamentary stage, sir?
I mean, it's a very interesting question. I always recognised that I was elected as a Conservative. I wasn't elected on my own merits, and therefore my default position had to be loyalty to the party, because that's why people in North East Somerset had sent me there. Within that, I'd been elected as a Conservative. So in the first 5 years, when we were a coalition and we were doing things that the Liberals wanted, I thought it was perfectly reasonable to speak out against them, because people in North East Somerset hadn't voted Liberal, and we were sacrificing things for the sake of a coalition. From then on, I thought that there was this very important constitutional choice on Brexit, which was beyond party. It was a major national interest constitutional matter, which I wanted to ensure went the right way, which then it did. And then after that had happened, we had a government that was, Theresa May's government didn't really grasp Brexit, didn't really believe in Brexit. And so they had to be held to account by me and many other Conservatives. And then, of course, when Boris came in, I was in his government and was bound by collective responsibility, which I must confess I sometimes found very difficult.
Collective responsibility, allegiance to party. How well, you live and die a conservative, sir, a large C conservative, in that you have an allegiance specifically to this party, and you're not stray off the path into other places. How devoted are you to this, to sort of exist under that banner?
To a high level, that it's my party, and I don't see why other people should take it over. I was actually speaking to a Conservative group on Wednesday at lunch in the Carlton Club, which was founded in 1832 as the Conservative Party's club. And somebody said to me, why didn't I go off to reform? And I pointed to the pictures around the room. Pitt the Younger, the Duke of Wellington, Lord Salisbury, the late Queen. Not that the late Queen can be called a Tory, but nonetheless, you think of these figures in our history who were in the Tory party, and that is the party that I have inherited, or I am part of the inheritance to, and I therefore would not wish to leave it. I want to remain in it and make it work.
There is talk of merging and, create, I don't know, maybe this creates another, blob of sorts, but on the right. I can tell you, sir, looking at our history, you just mentioned history. In 2003, the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, a federal party that was the party of our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, merged with a Western upstart populist party called, you guessed it, the Reform Party. Yeah. They united the right. They won in 2006. They won a majority in 2011. They governed for a decade. Should there be a Reform Conservative merging on your side of the pond, do you think? And would it be beneficial to Conservative voters?
Well, I think we should learn from our friends. We should learn both from Canada and indeed from Australia. I'm not sure which model is right, but Australia has the National Party and the Liberal Party, who aren't in a formal merger, but are always aligned in federal elections. You had the the merger of the Reform Party and the Progressive Conservatives to great effect and great success. If you look at previous British history, we had the Liberal Unionists who we worked with in the 1880s and governed with and then formally merged with later on. In a first-past-the-post system, you need your wing of politics to be united. So we have somehow or another to reunite the right if we wish to win the next election.
Mm-hmm. So you'll have to take tips from them, or learn from them, but not necessarily formalize any sort of partnership.
That's right. These things take time. They can't be done overnight. You've got differences between the parties, and so, excuse me. So you've got to decide how to work that through. But at the next election, we need to have some arrangement, otherwise Labour will win again.
Mm-hmm. One of the things we're seeing in the U.S. On the right is Reagan, Bush era conservatives being dismissed, lost in a populist tidal wave that are MAGA American conservatives. Is there a fear that those classic conservatives in your country might be taken by a similar sort of wave?
Well, Ronald Reagan was a populist politician in his time. He was very popular. I don't think being populist is a criticism. As a democratic politician, you want to be popular, you want to win votes. And I think populist is a term used by politicians who are unpopular and ones usually who don't much want to change anything and want to be governed by the civil service. So I'm not against populism. I think that Trump has noticed something, and that is a lot of government around the world has had nothing to do with voters.
Mm.
Take the Green Agenda. The Green Agenda has all been about punishing your own economy for some practically religion about emissions that makes people cold and poor. And China and India aren't doing it. Emissions are going up because of them. And Trump has had the courage to say, look, this is just a lot of nonsense.
Mm.
And I want people to say that in the UK as well, because our electricity prices are 4 times those for industrial usage of those in the United States. It's crippling industry. And so you want politicians who stand up for the standard of living of the people they represent, and Trump is doing that. So although I think the way he's treating Canada is unfortunate, I'm not supportive of that. I do think what he's doing domestically is very important, and people can learn from that.
Mm. At the same time, obviously, conservatives should have some sort of environmental agenda. They have to put something on the table. We're learning that in our election right now. What does a conservative approach to climate change, approach to environmentalism look like?
We should aim for cheap energy to ensure that people are prosperous. That should be the absolutely underpinning argument. We should not destroy our economies when other people aren't doing anything to theirs. That the UK has 0.9% of global emissions. It makes no difference what we do. We shouldn't fall for this nonsense that we lead the world. President Putin is not sitting in the Kremlin waiting to hear what Canada and the United Kingdom are doing in terms of their environmental policies, and it's fanciful to think that he is, or President Xi, or Prime Minister Modi. They're thinking, how do they make their countries more prosperous? So we should look to cheap energy. We should look to technology. How do we provide more cheap energy using better technologies? And how do we ameliorate climate change if and when climate change happens? What do you need to do? Bear in mind, more people die each year from cold than heat, so being hotter may not necessarily be intrinsically a bad thing. Does a warmer climate make some areas of Canada more hospitable to live in than they are when the world is very cold? These are all sorts of things that we need to think about. What are the positives from climate change, as well as just the risks, and how do you ameliorate the risks as they arise?
You mentioned Vladimir Putin, and I want to touch on this because your prime minister said recently that Europe, I guess including your country, would be willing to put, the quote is, boots on the ground, planes in the air as it relates to the war in Ukraine. I assume these would be peacekeepers of some sort. Vladimir Putin wants nothing to do with this. He won't have it. What's your opinion on that comment, boots on the ground, be they British boots or otherwise?
Well, I think we've got to be realistic about what can be done without the United States. And unfortunately, that is not as much as some people have been talking about. Putin is a fundamentally bad man and needs to be stopped. This is really important, not just for Europe, but globally. Why? Because he will carry on and other dictators will realize they can do the same thing. It's fundamentally destabilizing globally if Putin is successful. But the global power is the United States. And if the United States doesn't want to do anything, I'm afraid Europe is huffing and puffing for the time being. Now, that may not last forever, and Europe may build up its defenses properly. And the European economies are much, much bigger than Russia's. Their technologies are better than Russia's. There is an ability to develop a proper military but that takes time. It's absolute classic in British history that if you look at the Napoleonic Wars, the First World War, the Second World War, we're not ready until it's already starting. And once again, we're not ready.
Hmm.
And we need to get ourselves ready, but that takes time. So, in the short term, I don't think we can put boots on the ground if America isn't in favor of it,
Hmm.
because I just don't think it would be a realistic threat to Putin.
I find it fascinating that although you've left the EU, you still appear to be the convener, or at least the prime minister is trying to be, Prime Minister Starmer, the convener, the one leading the charge when it comes to the EU's response to Ukraine. And that, Zelensky leaves that horrible Oval Office meeting, comes straight to England. A conference is held by Keir Starmer. What is Britain's role in Europe in 2025?
Well, Britain's role in Ukraine has been absolutely fundamental. That bear in mind the Minsk agreements were done by France and Germany, and they were terrible agreements, which essentially allowed Putin to win at that stage. Ukraine 3 years ago was saved thanks in part, in significant part, to Boris Johnson ensuring that the tank busting weapons had been delivered to Ukraine. When we were doing that, when we were delivering them, we didn't even ask to fly over German airspace because we thought the Germans would say no. So the UK has very much led, and Boris Johnson very much led, the support for Ukraine in standing up to Russia, regardless of whether we're in the European Union. We are a key member of NATO. And the UK is in an interesting position because we have always been a country that's globally interested rather than narrowly Europeanly interested,
Mm.
um, because of our physical geographic location. And that gives us, I think, an interest. And we've done things like AUKUS, the relationship with Australia and the US for the sharing of nuclear information for nuclear submarines, that show that we are interested in what's going on globally. And we help bring that to the continental Europeans who are perhaps more narrowly focused.
Just a few more questions for you. Looking towards Canada again, we're in the midst of an election. I don't, of course, you mentioned, I don't want you to commit any sort of political interference here, but after 10 years of being governed by the Liberal Party, I'm wondering, just bird's eye view, what sort of advice or message you have for Canadians or Canadian Conservatives?
I think it's impertinent of foreign politicians to give advice. Beyond saying that I think Canada is a wonderful country that it's been an absolute privilege to visit over many years. Um, Canada is a great country and deserves to have great leadership. I think, as a matter of course, that Conservative governments are more effective than left-wing governments. I think that governments that know what a man is and what a woman is are generally better governments than ones that get confused on these matters. I think that governments that secure their borders and make sure that immigration is kept under control are better governments. I think governments that are focused on cheap energy are better governments. But how people then put that into practice in their votes is a matter for His Majesty's Canadian subjects.
You have a similarity with the current Conservative leader. You got into politics very young. I found archival footage of you. You couldn't have been more than 16, Mr. Rees-Mogg, going door to door leafleting. You first ran for politics when you were 27. I think you were elected in 2010. You then served 14 years. Pierre Poilievre first ran in 2000 when he was 21 years old. He served for 21 years in Canadian Parliament so far. Why is it a good thing to enter politics so young? You'll hear critics say, you should not be getting into this sort of partisan world at such a young age. That it doesn't do good things for development. Why is it good for the development of a well-rounded citizen?
Well, in my eye line, but not in the camera's eye line, is a bust of Pitt the Younger, who was one of our most successful prime ministers and was prime minister at the age of, it's either 23 or 24, I forget which immediately. And he was a brilliant prime minister. So what was it? His father, Pitt the Elder, said, "The atrocious crime of being a young man I shall neither attempt to palliate nor deny. there's nothing wrong with being young and being interested in politics. Though I'm very lucky because I was also in business. I set up my own financial services business in emerging markets investment management. And therefore, I had, by the time I got into Parliament, although when I first stood, I was quite young, quite a lot of business experience as well. So I feel very lucky to have both elements within in my political career. But there's nothing wrong with being young, and there's nothing wrong with finding politics exciting.
What skills do you think you learned in Parliament? What did you relish most? For, being in that the back and forth of the parliamentary scene there.
Well, I very much enjoyed the debating. I enjoyed finding out how you make the system work, that how do you get legislation through, what do you have to do to change how the country is governed. But also I found the constituency work very rewarding, and that was day to day correspondence with constituents and meeting constituents for whom every so often you could do things that change their lives for the better. And that was really important local work. And I'm speaking to you, as I said, from Somerset, so it was local to here. I would hold constituency surgeries weekly. People would come to me with really difficult problems, and every so often you could do something for them that changed their lives for the better. And that was some of the most rewarding work that I did.
All this to say, you will be running again, I assume. You'll be re-entering the fray.
Oh, I'd love to if anyone will have me. Yes.
Well, not anyone. We've made sure it has to be the Conservatives. Yes.
Perhaps I should become governor of the Bank of Canada.
Yes. No, there's some discussion over here in that that's now seen as a pipeline into politics, and what precedent has been set there. Let me end on this. You, sir, are an internet sensation. You're a meme. There is a word now in at least my dictionary online, mogged, being outclassed or intellectually dominated in a very posh, old-fashioned, and overly confident manner, usually by someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg. You and your wife have 6 children. You now have them starring in a reality TV show. You are somehow on the cutting edge, but also you are called someone from the 18th century. How does that work? How do you exist between those 2 points?
Well, I have no idea. I fear my jibe at Mr. Carney could be made back at me as a sort of second-tier English politician with an occasional internet presence. The internet fascinates me, but I wouldn't claim to be an expert on it. It's so important in political communication, but I find that what works and what doesn't is very often more luck than judgment. And what people like is things that are slightly amusing, slightly quirky, and perhaps, in a word that's become very cliched, authentic. And that's what people are looking for. They don't want the polished politician from central casting. They want the person who they think is true to himself, which was why I was happy to do the reality program, because people have always said to me, you can't really be like that, can you? And I've said, nobody in their right mind would make up my image. You'd be a very odd image creator who did that. It is as you see. And the Discovery program, the behind the scenes reality TV, shows that for better or worse, I am exactly what you see.
Just to add some meat on the bone, and you could tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think the nanny that looked after you, Nanny Veronica, when you were a child, looks after your kids, if I'm not mistaken. She's 80 years old. You got your kids reading broadsheet newspapers when they were young. They're dressed in, I guess, custom-tailored suits from I don't know what age. What are the quirky aspects that you think people...
My eldest son, when he was little, always wanted to dress like me, which he was free to do. My younger children haven't wanted to, so they wear clothes that other children wear. It's never been my enforcing things. I'm actually... I always wanted to be this Victorian paterfamilias, but in fact, my children run rings around me, and I basically do whatever they tell me. No, they don't have custom-made suits. We do dress for dinner on Saturday nights. That's the one thing we do.
Mm-hmm. Just before I leave you, any custom that you keep alive? I know history is very important to you. When it comes to your family, and I know you're joining us from your home now, is there anything that you sort of keep alive within your family?
Well, I'm very keen to encourage and teach my children about their Catholic faith, which I think is fundamentally important, and to do so via the old rite of the Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, which interestingly my children prefer to the modern Mass. I think this is not for complex theological reasons, but because it tends to be shorter, which for children is perhaps all they're looking for from church services.
What's lost by not having those connections, sir? Like what when you are just existing in modernity without looking back and reaching back towards the past and having that connection? What does that leave you?
Oh, well, you're then in a sort of communist state, aren't you? That's had a year zero and lost any connection with your history, an understanding of where you have come from, and learning, of course, from the mistakes that our forefathers have made, so that we can avoid making them. I think history is tremendously important as a guide to people's lives. It's also, I find, absolutely fascinating. I mean, as I said, I was telling my children about 1759 and General Wolfe, and what General Wolfe does is exciting. And he climbs up, nobody notices, he gets there, he gets killed at the end of the battle. It's really exciting boys' own stuff. And so history is fun as well as useful.
We always like to have people on who say that Canadian history is exciting rather than boring, because there's far too many people calling it boring. That is Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg, former British cabinet minister and Conservative MP for North East Somerset, where he joined us today. Thank you very much for coming on the program.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.